So welcome everybody. I'm very excited to introduce to you Will Kymlicka. I will now tell you why, because it's not just a little blah blah blah. It's indeed very important for me. I have spent decades really on reading animal liberation, animal rights literature. I have been on the case since the early 1980s. I have been on seminars in the early 80s at the university studying Peter Singer's practical ethics, and from there animal liberation. Then I've had the revelation of reading Tom Regan. We also did seminars on this, and then a number of other authors came across, be it Mark Rowland, be it Bernard Rollin, then be it Bluha with Beyond Prejudice, or be it the whole debate on babies and beasts, this argument from the marginal cases. But after some time, it felt a bit repetitive. A bit of a new angle, in my view, came when the debate shifted a bit towards the political angle. But then, like Robert Garner, it was more about the political aspects of the animal liberation movement and of the topic of animal rights. So I thought that was that. In a sense, it would have been possibly enough to read the book from 1822, the first book on animal rights, the founder of the Royal Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. I believe it was then the society, it hadn't the ethics of Royal. It came 80 years later. Then already the arguments were spilled out. And yeah, and then 2012, I came across this book, Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka. And it was completely new territory and important territory, because it was about how could an ideal society or a multi-species society really work. It wasn't the theoretical talk about principles of rights. It was the practical talk of how can we establish, how can we establish such a multi-species society. And it isn't sufficient really to say, and you learn that in that book, to say, okay, farmed animals nobody needs, so we just let them die out. There is an argument for such animals and species having a place as well. But it's not just farmed animals that humans interact with. There's also wild animals and wild animal communities. And indeed, there is a bit of a debate on being very paternalistic to them, really changing them towards being vegan, or even keeping them almost in zoo-like enclosures, versus an approach that gives them an autonomous status outside of human society that should be respected. A debate well worth having. And in all this context, possibly the most interesting ones are those animal species who are in between, who are wild in the sense that they are not domesticated and unfed by humans, but they still are culture followers. They still live within human society. A very difficult problem that hasn't practically been taken on by the animal movement so far at all, it seems to me. So I can all put that to your hearts to read this book, and especially I'm excited to listen to the talk today, because Professor Will Kymlicka was supposed to talk in Vienna for us at conferences before. It just never came about. Thanks to Corona, it's now online possible. If Wikipedia is to be believed, then he's a political philosopher in the University of Queens in Kingston in Ontario, Canada, and has been faithfully vegan for the last 20 years. At least that's what Wikipedia tells us. So I'm very happy to have you, Will Kymlicka, now present to us your talk towards an animal-friendly democracy.
Thank you, Martin, for that very kind introduction, and thank you and Paula for the invitation. It's great to finally be here with you all. So this is work that I'm doing with Sue Donaldson, my co-author, and it's stuff that will be part of our next book, focusing on animals and democratic theory. But before I get to the democratic theory part, let me just quickly step back and say a bit about our broader vision of interspecies justice. Martin has already given you a bit of a hint about this, but so our account assumes that, that there are two levels of animal rights. The first level, all sentient animals should be seen as possessing certain universal basic rights. So this is a view we share with really most animal rights theories, that animals are not just resources to be used for our benefit. They have their own moral status, they have their own lives to lead, and that means there's a series of things we must not do in our relations with animals. We must not harm them or kill them or cage them and so on. So those are really important. That's a series of prohibitions on how we relate to animals. But by themselves, those universal basic rights don't tell us much about how we should relate to animals. What kind of relationships with animals would be good relationships to have once we stop killing and harming them? And so our assumption is that different groups of animals are likely to want to have different kinds of relationships with human societies, and that we should be responsive to these different kinds of preferences. And so as a starting point, we just propose three different kinds of patterns of human-animal relationships that might emerge. So the first category concerns domesticated animals. So the animals that over centuries or millennia we have bred to live and work alongside us in the domus, domesticated in the household. So these could be companion animals, farmed animals, working animals, and so on. Our view is that because, as a result of domestication, we have brought these animals out of the wild into our society, and we need to recognize them now as indeed members of our society. It's their society as much as ours, and therefore they need membership rights with respect to this shared society. And in political philosophy, we often talk about citizenship rights as the technical term for membership rights. So we should view domesticated animals as our co-citizens, and that includes having membership rights with respect to public goods, public services, public spaces, and so on. On the opposite end, there are what we might call truly wild animals or wilderness animals, who live as far as possible away from humans, who avoid human contact, who live on their own territory, their own habitat. And our view is that these wilderness animals should be seen as having rights to their territory. They need territorial rights and the rights to live autonomously on their territory. So it's their land, not ours, and they have the right to live autonomously on their territory. And again, in political philosophy, this bundle of rights, of territorial rights and autonomy rights, is often called sovereignty. So we could think about wilderness communities of wild animals as having a form of sovereignty over themselves and their territory. And then we have this intermediary category, which Martin mentioned, of what we call liminal animals. So they're animals that are not domesticated, but rather than living far away from us, they live right amongst us. So you can think about urban wildlife as the paradigmatic example of liminal animals. So it could be, you know, pigeons, rats, mice, squirrels, raccoons, geese and ducks, and so on. These animals are often seen as kind of pest animals who don't really belong in the city. But our view is that we need to accept that this is now their space as much as ours, and so they have residency rights that should be protected, and we need to learn to have a kind of tolerant coexistence with them. And we label this the idea of denizenship. So this is our big picture. I realize that's very vague, and but this is our picture of what a future just society might look like. Universal basic rights for all sentient animals, and then different kinds of relationships that might emerge, each of which would come with its own package of relational rights or differentiated rights. So membership rights for domesticated animals, territorial rights for wilderness animals, and residency rights for liminal animals. amongst others. So I don't know whether any of you find that an attractive image of a future just society with animals, but whatever your vision of animal justice, I suspect you'll agree that we're very far away from it. Our current relations with animals are, I think, a kind of moral catastrophe. We are very, very far away from any picture of interspecies justice. So we can ask, what are the barriers? Why aren't we making better progress towards justice for animals? And I think it's useful to distinguish two different kinds of challenges we face as a movement. One is, and this is the one that most animal rights theorists and activists have focused on for the past 50 years, is about making the case for the moral status of animals, making the case that animals have an intrinsic moral status, that their lives matter morally. So Singer famously expressed this with the image that we need to expand the moral circle, that many people seem to think that only humans are in the moral circle, but we need to expand the moral circle to include animals. So I think that's an important task. I actually think there's been some success in that task. So depending on how you ask the question, if we do surveys that ask about people's beliefs, most people, actually the vast majority of people, agree that animals are within the moral circle. That means different things to different people, but in general, the moral circle has been expanded, and there's various ways of trying to empirically show how that moral circle has expanded over the past several decades. But I think there's a second challenge that we've had far less success with, which concerns the political status of animals. So maybe animals are being included in the moral community, but are they being included in the political community? So what would that mean? What does it mean to be included in the political community? So we live in a democracy. So democracy is so we can ask, are animals members of the demos? Democracy is about the rule of the people. It's the rule of the people, by the people, for the people. So we could ask, are animals included in the people in whose name the state governs in a democracy? And here I think we have to say there's been no progress. Like, there's not a single country around the world which includes animals in their conception of the demos or of the people. So I think this is a real barrier. We're making some progress on moral status, but I think we've hit a dead end with respect to, we've hit a wall with respect to political status. And I'm increasingly of the view that this is the real heart of human supremacism. So for Singer and Regan, they argued that the core of human supremacism is the idea that only humans have moral status. I'm increasingly of the view that actually lots of people are willing to extend moral status to animals, but what they cling to as the heart of human exceptionalism is the idea that only humans can have political status. Only humans can be a member of the demos or of the people. And I think the result is that animals are completely marginalized and excluded from all ways of conceiving of politics. So I think we need to go beyond arguments about moral status, and we need to spend more time thinking about how animals relate to political theory and in particular democratic theory, how they relate to ideas of the demos and the political community. So I'm not alone in this. There are now several of my colleagues working on these issues. The group of us are sometimes called the political turn in animal ethics, by which meaning that we're interested in debates about political status, not just moral status. And we're all interested in the question about how we can include animals in our account of democracy. So how do we include animals in democracy? Most of my colleagues in this in the political turn have a very simple answer, a very quick answer, and what they hope is a very powerful answer, which is that animals have affected interests. So government decisions affect animals. And according to my colleagues, democracy rests on what they call the all-affected interest principle. So that says that everyone whose interests are affected by a decision should be represented in that decision. And according to my colleagues, this is the foundational principle of democracy. Democracy just is the principle that all those who are affected should be represented in political decision-making. And if that were true, if that really were the foundational principle of democracy, we would have an easy argument for including animals in democracy, because their interests clearly are affected. The problem, from my point of view, is that I just do not believe that democracy is based on the all-affected interest principle. I just think this is a misinterpretation of democracy. And so we're heading off down the wrong path if we appeal to the all-affected interest principle. So if you think about any real-world democracy, so you may be at the moment in Austria, I'm in Canada, I'm a Canadian citizen. Who has the right to participate in Canadian politics? Well, the answer is it's Canadian citizens. That is to say, the long-term residents of Canada, those who are members of Canadian society, have the right to participate in Canadian democracy. We have the right to determine the future of Canadian society through our self-government, democratic self-government. Now, the decisions we make as Canadians clearly affect outsiders. So our trade policy is going to affect workers in Mexico. Our immigration policy is going to affect potential immigrants in Pakistan. Our energy policy, our environmental policy is going to affect our neighbors in the United States. And those impacts matter, but the way in which they matter is not that that means that workers in Mexico get to vote in Canadian elections, or that potential immigrants from Pakistan get to vote. Instead, the principle is, I mean, they are viewed as third parties. They're not members of the demos, they're third parties. And as third parties, they have certain rights that must not be infringed when Canadians are making decisions about the future of Canadian society. And so Canadian democracy, but Austrian democracy, Danish democracy, all democracies around the world distinguish members who have the right to steer the future of the society from third parties who have rights that must be respected. So the rights of third parties set limits within which members determine the future of their shared society. This is the structural logic of all actually existing democracies. Members steer the future of a shared society. The rights of third parties set the limits within which those choices can be made. And these third-party constraints are typically enforced by something like international law. So there would be international law that constrains Canada's ability to, say, impose unfair trade agreements on Mexico or on other countries, or that international law would constrain any attempt by Canada to dump our pollution onto third parties. So as you all know, international law is not necessarily very good at protecting third-party rights, but that's the structural feature of democracy, is it empowers members to steer the future of their society within the limits set by the rights of third parties. So if we say that animals have affected interests, then that's actually not, that doesn't, in real world democracies, that does not get you included in the demos any more than workers in Mexico get included in the Canadian demos. Having affected interest is not an entry into the demos. The all affected interest principle is just not accurate as an account of how democracy operates. It does get them included as third parties. And it would certainly be a good thing if we had better international law that protected the rights of animals as third parties. And we could imagine trying to strengthen international law to put firmer safeguards on the decisions of democracies to make sure that they're not violating the rights of animals as third parties. But that's different from the idea of actually including animals in democracy. That's different from the idea that animals' interests should actually shape democratic decision-making, as opposed to setting limits within which democratic decision-making takes place. So if animals are only included as affected interests, as affected third parties, that would certainly be better than the status quo, which ignores them entirely. But it would not be including animals in the core of democracy. It would leave them kind of permanently on the margins as third parties. So I don't think that's an adequate, again, it's better than nothing, but it's not, to my mind, an animal-friendly democracy if animals are always relegated to the margins as third parties. So I'm interested in the question whether we can bring animals into the core of democracy so that their interests actually help to steer decision-making rather than simply constrain decision-making. So it seems to me that if we want to bring animals into the core of democracy, we have two basic strategies. One strategy, and this is the one that Sue and I have adopted in our work, is that we accept the idea that democracy is built on the distinction between members and third parties, because I really just believe this is a structural feature of democracy, is that it distinguishes members from third parties. But we rethink who are members and who are third parties in a more interspecies way. And in particular, what our strategy has been to, on the one hand, say that we should think of wilderness animals, or truly wild animals, as forming, they're members of their own self-governing communities. So they form their own demoi, their own demos, their own self-governing political communities, and we humans need to accept that we are merely third parties with respect to their self-governing communities. And because we're third parties, we have no right to steer their communities or their territories, right? So here the distinction between members and third parties works to the benefit of wild animals because it requires humans to accept that we are merely third parties. We may have rights that need to be respected, but our interests, our desires, our inclinations should not, we have no right for those to be steering the future of wild animal communities and their territories. So one strategy is to think about wild animals as forming their own self-governing communities to which we are third parties. But then in relation to domesticated animals, we want to argue that domesticated animals should be seen as members of our demos. Domesticated animals are not merely third parties. They're not merely affected interests. That minimizes how centrally they should be seen as part of our shared society. They're not just third parties. They are members. And because they are members of a shared demos, they have the right to steer the exercise of political power. Their interests, their aspirations, their hopes should shape how power is exercised over our shared society because they're members. And that right to shape the future comes with membership, not just with third-party status. So this is our strategy, and I'll return to that later. Again, we accept that democracy distinguishes members from third parties, but we try to get that distinction to work for animals, either by seeing them as forming their own self-governing communities to which humans are just third parties, or by getting them to be seen as members within our shared demos. However, most of my colleagues in the political turn are not optimistic or attracted to this membership strategy. Sue and I are somewhat on our own in the idea of trying to invoke a membership strategy in defense of animals. Most of our colleagues adopt a cosmopolitan strategy to include animals in democracy. So a cosmopolitan strategy basically just rejects the very distinction between members and third parties. So on a cosmopolitan conception of democracy, we don't ask, is someone a member or a third party? All we ask is, do they have interests? And would those interests be affected? And then we think of democracy as a mechanism for fairly counting, for fairly aggregating all affected interests. Again, whether or not they're members or third parties, because we don't distinguish members and third parties. We just scan the environment to see whose interests would be affected, and then we try to aggregate those interests in some fair way. So my colleagues in the political turn tend to think that this would be the most friendly way to include animals in democracy is to reject the distinction between members and third parties. Okay, I've called this a cosmopolitan strategy. I think it's useful to actually distinguish two different dimensions of cosmopolitanism, both of which I think are at play in my colleagues' work. One is what I've just described. One we can call democratic cosmopolitanism, which is what I've just described. Namely, we don't distinguish members from third parties. We just count interests. But that's related to, but different from what we can call terrestrial cosmopolitanism. So this is the idea that the world should be seen as a global commons. The world is given to all of us, humans and animals alike, as a global commons. It belongs to all of us in common. We are all commoners with respect to the global commons, as distinct from the status quo in which nation states claim territorial rights. So countries like Austria or Canada claim that we have territorial rights over certain bits of the world. So bits of the world, according to our governments, are not part of the global commons. They are subject to territorial rights by nations or peoples. So terrestrial cosmopolitanism says we shouldn't accept the principle that nations or peoples have territorial rights over bits of the world. We should instead think of the world as belonging to all in common. And this has implications for things like mobility rights. If the world is a global commons and we're all commoners, then in principle we should have the right to move freely across the global commons, since we all have an equal right to being commoners on the global commons. So this tends towards a kind of open borders philosophy. Okay, so the cosmopolitan strategy that many of my colleagues endorse endorses both of these forms of cosmopolitanism: a democracy that doesn't distinguish members and third parties, and a terrestrial cosmopolitanism that thinks of the world as a global commons, not subject to territorial rights. So this is a strategy for including animals. It's worth noting just how radical this strategy is, and radical not because it includes animals, because that's true also about the membership strategy that Sue and I endorse. It's radical because it requires kind of entirely rethinking the very nature of democracy and political community. Existing democracies are bounded democracies that create a we, a nation or a people, that governs our territory. So it's a membership-based, existing democracies are based on ideas of membership, a we, and on territory, our territory. Whereas cosmopolitanism says basically, don't ask about who's a member and don't think of this as our territory. Let's just instead scan the environment to see who has affected interests. Okay, so I actually think if we want to include animals in democracy, we need to decide between this membership strategy and the cosmopolitan strategy. And we need to ask which is good for animals. So I think it's interesting that so many of my colleagues are attracted to the cosmopolitan strategy, and they seem to assume that it would clearly be a better world for animals if we shifted from membership-based democracies to cosmopolitan democracy. And it's not obvious to me, and that's really what I just want to push on in this paper. I'm genuinely curious why people are why animal rights activists are so, why they see an elective affinity with cosmopolitanism, and why they think cosmopolitanism would be good for animals. So obviously, trying to figure out which of these models is good for animals is it's very speculative, because no existing membership democracies have included animals, and we have no examples of cosmopolitan democracy. So it's not like we can go out and look at, actually existing cases of membership democracies that include domesticated animals, or cosmopolitan democracies that count the interests of animals. We have to just speculate about which of these two visions of democracy would be good for animals. I mean, I think we should also ask which would be good for humans, but also for this talk, which of these would be good for animals. So what I'm about to say is preliminary, it's speculative. I don't have 100% confidence in what I'm about to argue, and I'm curious to get people's feedback. But here's my way of trying to think this through. Because just to repeat, I think the barrier we've run into as an animal rights movement is we've had some success about moral status, but we've had no success on political status. So we need to really slow down and think about, what does political status mean? And that requires us to think about, what is a demos? What is a people? What is a political community? I think this may seem quite removed from some day-to-day activist issues, about, how do we close down factory farming? But I think if we want to think about just futures with animals, we need to think about political status, and then we need to think about what is democracy. And is it the membership idea, or is it cosmopolitan? Okay, so here's my way of just trying to struggle through this issue. And again, it's preliminary and tentative, and I welcome pushback. So here's my way of thinking about it. Humans and animals, or humans and non-human animals, we all have a set of interests. We all have a diverse range of interests. But we might think that some of these interests are tied to this place we are, the specific place we inhabit at the moment. We also have interests in what happens elsewhere. So at the moment, I'm living in Canada. I have some place-based interests in the future of Canada, but I also have interests in what happens in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in Korea. Some of these maybe because I have economic ties, or because I have family ties, or because I have cultural ties. So I have these extraterritorial interests, but I also have interests in what happens here, my place-based interests. So we all have a catalog of interests. And now the question is, how does democracy relate to this catalog of interests? And the membership model, which is the idea that the demos is limited to members, it prioritizes our place-based interests over our extraterritorial interests. So when Austria has an election, or Canada has an election, think about what we're being asked to decide when we make a decision in a national election. The political system calls upon us as members. It hails us as members of a Canadian society, and it asks us, what do we Canadians want to do with our society into the future, where we view our shared society as our common possession? That's the question that is set to us by a bounded democracy. It doesn't just hail us as sentient. It doesn't say, as a sentient individual, what's your interest? What are your preferences? It says, as a Canadian citizen, it hails us as a member, and it says, what do you want to do as a Canadian with other Canadians about what we have in common, namely our shared society? That's the question that a bounded democracy asks. It zeroes in on particular, it doesn't just ask about all of our interests, it asks about the specific interests we have in this place with our co-members. So a bounded democracy orients us towards what we have in common, this shared society, and asks, what do we want to do with what we have in common, right? So a bounded democracy, yeah, it zeroes in on, it focuses in on a subset of our interests, namely those that are in this place with the we and the our. A cosmopolitan democracy, by contrast, is agnostic about which interests get politically mobilized. It just looks around and asks, basically, it looks around and says, okay, you are all sentient individuals. You've all got a catalog of interests. Let's count them up. And so a cosmopolitan democracy puts place-based interests and extraterritorial interests on the same footing. It counts all interests of all individuals as counting towards determining a legitimate political decision. So in my view, this is a really interesting, I think this is interesting, that these are two different ways of thinking about democracy. And I think they generate very different pictures about what democracy is, about why we might value democracy, but they also, I think, have very different implications for how animals might fit into democracy. So I think it's worth asking, would animals do better in a political system that prioritizes place-based membership interests over extraterritorial interests? Or would animals do better in a cosmopolitan democracy that just counts all interests on an equal footing? I think that's kind of an interesting question. Again, it's speculative, and it almost certainly depends on which animals we have in mind. The category of animals is, impossibly heterogeneous. There's a gazillion different kinds of animals. Some animals would probably do better in a bounded democracy. Some might do better in a cosmopolitan democracy. We would need to specify which animals we're talking about. But still, here are some reasons why I think, in general, a cosmopolitan democracy would be bad for animals. I actually think a cosmopolitan democracy would be very unsafe for animals. So I think there are two main points of difference between a bounded democracy and a cosmopolitan democracy. The first is about territory. So as I said, terrestrial cosmopolitanism is based on the idea that all of us, the world belongs to all of us in common, whereas a bounded democracy starts on the premise that certain groups have rights over certain territories, including the right to restrict in migration. So we might ask, will animals fare better in a society, in a political system that endorses terrestrial cosmopolitanism, or one that recognizes territorial rights? So in order to make progress on this, we might, so why do humans why do we think that territorial rights are good for humans? And then we can think about whether they'd be good for animals as well. So in the case of humans, there's a big debate about why countries like Austria or Canada claim territorial rights, including the right to regulate who enters the country. And the usual argument is that human beings are the kinds of beings who have what are called located life plans. So we don't just have intellectual beliefs about the value of, say, a religious life as compared to a secular life, or having a family life as compared to living alone, or physical activity versus intellect. I mean, so we have these beliefs about how certain kinds of activities are better than others, but they aren't just abstract beliefs, they're located. They're located in very specific places, and so our ability to pursue our life plans often depends on and gets invested in and tied to specific locations, and that our lives therefore go better when we're able to have greater security with respect to our access to the locations in which our life plans are located. And so that over time, individuals and communities can come to have strong enough interests in their located life plans that it justifies territorial rights. That's the argument that is widely made in political philosophy for why humans have territorial rights. Those arguments are very controversial. It's a big ongoing debate in political philosophy about whether territorial rights are justified. Many critics argue that this whole argument for territorial rights overstates the importance of located life plans and understates the importance of our mobility interests. So many critics argue, yes, humans have located life plans, but we also have mobility projects. We have migration projects. We might want to move halfway around the world. And in order to be able to successfully pursue migration projects, we need mobility rights. And in order for us to have mobility rights, then we need to weaken territorial rights, because territorial rights limit mobility rights. So this is a big debate in political philosophy in relation to humans. How do we think about the trade-off between mobility rights and territorial rights? I think that's a really interesting, really important debate. And it may be true that in the case of humans, we have put too much weight on territorial rights and not given enough weight to mobility rights. I think that is an argument that is worth having. But if it's true that we should give more weight to mobility rights for humans, it's because of something very specific to humans. Namely, that we are the kinds of beings who are adaptive generalists. That's to say, human beings, amongst all the species on the planet, we are amongst the most capable of adapting to very different environments. So we could be born in one latitude and longitude with one kind of weather, one kind of geography, one kinds of plant life and animal life and so on, hot, cold, dry, wet, and we can move halfway around the world to a completely different environment and adapt and have a good life halfway around the world. So we have, the reason, so mobility projects are intelligible in the case of humans because because we have the meaningful capacity as adaptive generalists to live our lives in completely different environments. We can imagine doing that, and we can adapt when we move halfway around the world. And so I think in the human case, there is a genuine trade-off between wanting territorial rights to protect located life plans and also wanting mobility rights. And it's an interesting question how we weigh those off in the human case. But if now the question is about animals, I think the debate is less of a debate. It seems clear to me that the vast majority of animals have a much stronger interest in territorial rights and much weaker interests in mobility. So most wild animals are not adaptive generalists. They are niche specialists. They can only survive in one very specific kind of environment. And for them, therefore, mobility rights, mobility interests are zero. They'll either survive where they are in their niche or they'll die. So they have absolutely vital place-based interests. And those place-based interests need to be protected from destabilizing influences by outsiders, above all, human outsiders, right? The greatest threat to the place-based interests of wild animals is human mobility. And so terrestrial cosmopolitanism authorizes humans to move freely into the territory of wild animals. So terrestrial cosmopolitanism licenses human colonization of the niches of wild animals. I think this is I think terrestrial cosmopolitanism is lethal for most wild animals. Wild animals need territorial rights above all against human colonization. The case, now you might think, well, but some wild animals migrate huge distances, and of course that's true. Whales and birds and vast migrations. But even there, I think it's important to remember that what we really have in those cases, they're still niche specialists. They just have two different niches where they are dependent. So they might have one niche where they breed and raise their young, and another niche where they feed. But in both cases, they might be dependent on extremely specific environmental niches. And in both of their places, they may be extremely vulnerable to being disrupted and displaced by outside influences, above all, human colonization. So I don't think migrating animals are actually an exception to the principle that wild animals are niche specialists whose place-based interests must be protected against mobility rights of humans. So domesticated animals are a different story. Many domesticated animals are like humans, they're adaptive generalists, which is why European colonizers were able to take their domesticated animals with them as they colonized much of the world. And so, so the British colonizers took sheep and cows and pigs around the world with them. And in many cases, domesticated animals were able to adapt to very different environments. So you might think that for domesticated animals like humans, they face a trade-off between mobility interests and territorial interests. But I think actually domesticated animals do not have migration projects. They don't imagine whether their life would be better off halfway around the world. What they care about is living well where they are. I think actually they have located life plans. So humans may have a choice between located life plans and migration projects. I think domesticated animals just have located life plans. They don't have migration projects. So I actually don't think that terrestrial cosmopolitanism is a response to the aspirations of animals. I just don't see how terrestrial cosmopolitanism is animal friendly. Let me put it another way. I think terrestrial cosmopolitanism is a political theory for adaptive generalists. It's a political theory that says, let's make the world as convenient as possible for adaptive generalists. Or to put it another way, terrestrial cosmopolitanism is a political theory for invasive species, above all humans, as a supreme example of invasive species. Terrestrial cosmopolitanism is basically a license for human colonization. So I don't see that terrestrial cosmopolitanism is animal friendly. I think animals would prefer a political order that's built on the principle of respect for territorial rights, including the territorial rights of wild animal communities. So the second area of dispute is about membership rights. So again, a membership-based democracy, it's not just about protecting territory, it's about constructing the idea that we're members of a shared society, and it orients us towards the concern for the future of a shared society. It tells us to take an interest in a shared, it hails us as members, tells us to put on our membership hat and think about what we can do together as members of a shared society. So do animals have an interest in a politics built around the idea of membership rather than just counting affected interests? So in the case of wild animals, to repeat, I don't think they have an interest in being seen as members of our demos. They rather should be seen as forming their own communities, their own political communities, to which we are third parties. So just to repeat, it's crucial, I think, for the thriving of wild animals that we see them as forming their own communities, they're members of their own communities, and we are not members of their communities, and therefore we are just third parties who have no right to steer their societies or their territories. But in the case of domesticated animals, I think that domesticated animals do indeed have a profound interest in being recognized not just as sentient beings who have affected interests, but in being recognized as members of a shared society with us. I think that this is a moral imperative of domestication. Having taken animals out of the wild and brought them into our society, we need to acknowledge that we now have responsibilities towards those domesticated animals as a result of domestication. And to just view them as if, well, they're just sentient beings with affected interests would be to deny the distinctive responsibility that we have because we have taken them out of the wild and brought them into our society. And so I think that the only just response to this long history of domestication is not to disavow domesticated animals and treat them as if they're foreigners, but rather to acknowledge that through domestication, they have come to have a birthright in our society. They now have a birthright to shape the direction of our shared society. So I think membership is a moral recognition of the obligations arising from domestication. But I also think, and this gets a bit complicated and probably will be too sketchy, but I also think that recognizing domesticated animals as members of a shared society is a precondition for them to have political agency. So this idea about domesticated animals having political agency is controversial. Some of my colleagues in the political turn think that it's not useful or intelligible to talk about domesticated animals as having political agency. They think that animals are just passive and mute. But Sue and I think that actually domesticated animals can be political agents, that they have preferences about how they want to live with us. They are often communicating. They're actually always communicating their preferences in embodied ways about what kinds of relationships they want to have with us, what kinds of activities they want to engage in with us. Of course, at the moment, most of the time we just ignore them, but their agency, when they're communicating to us about what kinds of lives they would like to lead with us, that could become effective political agency if we create contexts in which humans and domesticated animals have a certain kind of stability of ongoing interaction that is sufficient to develop trust and to develop a sufficient level of mutual knowledge that we can then engage in kind of democratic experiments about how to live together. That we're domesticated animals and humans have lived together long enough, and if there is a certain sufficient solidarity there, then we can create the conditions for actually allowing humans and domesticated animals to explore different kinds of society together. So Sue and I have been particularly interested over the years in the idea of farmed animal sanctuaries as a site for this kind of political agency, for this kind of political experimentation. So in sanctuaries for formerly farmed animals, you have precisely these preconditions that there's a stability of membership. So there's the humans and the animals. It's a forever home for the animals, so they are seen as permanent members of the community. There's a stability of the humans who are there, and they begin over time to develop a sense of community, a sense of membership in a shared project, and that as those feelings of trust and knowledge develop in this stable membership community, you can create the conditions for exploring different possible ways of life. So we've talked about how sanctuaries could be sites for exploring different kinds of work relationships, different kinds of family relationships, different kinds of physical environments, and so on. But the point is that all of this is possible only if it's built on a kind of ethic of membership in which we are committed to viewing ourselves as stable members of a stable community, building a we. Political agency for domesticated animals, I think, requires a kind of the building of a we, the membership of a political community that then creates the conditions for political agency. So, and again, if all we did was just count up affected interests of sentient individuals, we would not have the conditions that would make it possible to develop genuinely effective political agency for domesticated animals. Okay, so just to sum up, what would an animal-friendly democracy look like? So I mean, the starting point for Sue and I, as against the cosmopolitans, is that democracy rests on some distinction between members and third parties. I really that's certainly the way existing democracies operate, but in my view, I think there are good reasons why democracy has developed on this basis. And so democracy is fundamentally about how the members of a shared society steer it into the future. And that's different from the question of impacts on third parties. We need to respect the rights of third parties, but democracy is about members steering within the limits set by third-party rights. I really think that's the most plausible. It's the most realistic and most plausible account of democracy, I think. And if we start from that picture of democracy, then the question is, where do animals fit? If democracy is built on a distinction between members and third parties, where do animals fit? So just to restate, I think that wilderness animals, truly wild animals, should be seen as forming their own society. They're members of their own society, and we are third parties with respect to their self-governing communities, and therefore we have no right to steer their lives or their territory. So again, the distinction between members and third parties works to disempower humans, which is what we need, that's what we want. We need to get humans to think of themselves as just third parties, not as having the right to continuously steer all life on this planet. But in relation to domesticated animals, we need to think of them as members. They're not just third parties, they're not just affected interests, they are members as a result of domestication, and that includes the right to steer the society that we now share together. And that means we need to think about mechanisms, democratic mechanisms, to solicit their input. We need to know something about how they would like the shared society to be steered. And I think there are exciting opportunities for experimenting in interspecies politics to enable the political agency of domesticated animals. Okay, so that's basically the talk. Thank you for hanging in there and for listening. If you have any comments or questions beyond today, feel free to email me. And I've just included here a couple of the recent articles that Sue and I have written, which elaborate on these ideas in a bit more detail. And I will stop there and turn it back to Martin.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for these interesting ideas.